The massive space station called New Geneva floated in the dark between the stars like a bright metal city. Inside its gleaming halls, the most powerful beings in the galaxy gathered to argue and fight with words instead of weapons. Captain Jake Morrison walked through the long corridors, his boots making soft sounds on the smooth floor. He had never seen anything like this place before. The walls seemed to stretch forever, and strange lights danced across surfaces he could not name. Was heading to the main council chamber where 3 alien species were meeting to discuss their latest problems. He had been sent here by Earth's government to observe and learn about galactic politics. Humans were still new to all of this. Just 20 years ago, they had been alone on their small blue planet, thinking they were the only intelligent life in the universe. Now Jake was walking among creatures that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. The council chamber doors opened with a quiet hiss. Jake stepped inside and felt his breath catch in his throat. The room was enormous, with a curved ceiling that showed the stars outside. 3 groups sat at different tables, each one looking angry and ready to fight. Jake found a small chair in the back corner where he could watch without being noticed. At the first table sat the Corvan delegates. They were tall and strong, with thick gray skin and sharp teeth that showed when they spoke. Their leader was War Commander Thackalon, a massive creature whose voice could shake the walls when he was angry. The Corvan believed that strength was everything. They had built the largest military force in the galaxy and were proud of their ability to conquer any enemy. The second table held the Zephyrian representatives. These beings looked very different from the Corvan. They were thin and pale, with large heads and eyes that seemed to glow within a light. Their skin was smooth like metal, and they moved in precise ways that reminded Jake of machines. Logic Prime Vexter spoke for them in a voice that had no emotion at all. The Zephyr trusted only in science and technology. They had created wonders that seemed like magic to most other species. The third group was the most mysterious to Jake. The Villani sat quietly at their table looking like tall humans made of light and shadow. Their leader, Harmony Keeper, had skin that changed colors like the surface of a calm lake. When she spoke, her voice carried strange harmonies that made Jake feel peaceful and sad at the same time. The Villani followed ancient spiritual paths and claimed they could touch the very soul of the universe. War Commander Thackalon slammed his massive fist on the table. The sound echoed through the chamber like thunder. The Kepler 442 system belongs to the strong, he growled. My ships found those worlds first. The quantum crystals there will power our fleets for 1,000 years. Any who challenge our claim will face the might of the Corvan Empire. Logic Prime Vextar raised one thin hand. Your emotional outburst demonstrates the primitive nature of your thinking, the Zephyrian said in that cold, emotionless voice. Our deep space scanners detected the quantum crystal formations 67 days before your crude vessels arrived. Superior technology grants superior rights. The crystals will be extracted using our advanced methods for the benefit of rational progress. Harmony Keeper Silana stood gracefully. When she moved, the air around her seemed to shimmer with soft colors. You both speak of ownership as if the universe were a thing to be divided and conquered, she said. The ancient songs tell us that the Kepler 442 system lies at the intersection of powerful spiritual currents. It is a sacred place that must remain untouched by war or greed. The crystals are not meant for your machines or weapons, but for higher purposes you cannot understand. Jake watched as the 3 leaders glared at each other across the chamber. Each species believed they were right. Each one thought the others were wrong and foolish. The argument went on for hours, with voices getting louder and tempers growing shorter. Jake began to understand why the galaxy was always on the edge of war. The Corvan wanted to take what they needed by force. The Zephyrians believed their advanced knowledge gave them the right to decide how everything should be used. The Villani claimed that spiritual wisdom was more important than military might or scientific progress. None of them wanted to listen to the others. As the day wore on, Jake noticed something troubling. Each time one species made a proposal, the other 2 immediately rejected it. When the Corvan suggested joint military exercises, the Zephyrians called it barbaric. When the Zephyrians offered to share their technology, the Villani said it would corrupt natural harmony. When the Villani spoke of meditation and spiritual growth, the Corvan laughed and called it weakness. Finally, the session ended with no agreement reached. War Commander Thackalon stormed out, promising that the Corvan would defend their claims with force if necessary. Logic Prime Vextar departed with cold warnings about the consequences of opposing Zephyrian interests. Harmony Keeper Solana left quietly, speaking soft words about the sadness of a universe divided against itself. Jake remained in his corner as the great chamber emptied. The silence felt heavy after all the angry words. He looked up at the ceiling where the stars still shone, beautiful and distant. Somewhere out there, entire worlds hung in the balance. If these three species went to war, billions of innocent beings would suffer and die. As he finally stood to leave, Jake wondered if there was anything a simple human could do to help. His species was young and weak compared to these ancient powers, but maybe, just maybe, being young meant seeing things differently. Sometimes the newest voice in the room had something important to say. The next morning brought terrible news that spread through New Geneva like wildfire. A Corvan patrol ship had opened fire on a Zephyrian research vessel near the disputed Kepler 442 system. The research vessel had been damaged but managed to escape before more Corvan ships arrived. Within hours, both sides were sending their fleets toward the contested worlds. Jake stood in the communication center, watching the massive viewscreens that showed ship movements across that region of space. Red dots marked Corvan battlecruisers moving in formation. Blue dots showed Zephyrian science ships surrounded by their escort fighters. Green dots indicated Volani, meditation vessels taking positions around the entire system. Each side claimed they were only protecting their legitimate interests, but everyone knew they were preparing for war. The emergency council session was called for midday. Jake made his way to the chamber early, hoping to find a better seat where he could see and hear everything clearly. The mood in the station was tense. Alien beings from dozens of different species moved through the corridors with worried expressions. Everyone understood that if these three major powers started fighting, the war could spread across the entire galaxy. When the session began, the anger from the previous day had grown much worse. War Commander Thackalon's grayskin was darker than usual, which Jake had learned meant the Corvan was furious. The Zephyrians fired first, he declared, his voice booming through the chamber. Their research vessel was equipped with weapons, designed to look like scientific equipment. When our patrol detected the deception, they defended themselves according to military protocol. We will not allow enemy spies to operate in Corvan space. Logic Prime Vexter's glowing eyes seemed brighter. As well, another sign of strong emotion despite the Zephyrians' usual calm demeanor. Your accusation lacks factual basis, the alien replied. Our vessel carried only standard defensive systems and deep space analysis equipment. Your unprovoked attack demonstrates the aggressive nature that makes your species unsuitable for civilized contact. We will respond with appropriate measures to protect our legitimate research interests. Harmony Keeper Solana had been silent, but now she rose with movements that seemed to flow like water. The sacred energies of the Kepler system cry out in pain, she said, her voice carrying harmonies that made Jake feel both sad and hopeful. Your conflict poisons the spiritual currents that flow through that space. The ancient powers will not allow such desecration to continue. We must defend the holy places from those who would corrupt them with violence and greed. The three leaders continued to argue, each one blaming the others for starting the crisis. Jake listened carefully, trying to understand not just their words, but the feelings behind them. The Corvan felt disrespected and threatened. The Zephyrians believed their superior knowledge was being ignored. The Volani saw their sacred beliefs being trampled by outsiders who did not understand that. As the arguments grew louder, Jake realized that something needed to change quickly or the situation would spiral into open war. He stood up slowly, his heart beating fast as dozens of alien eyes turned toward him. Most of the delegates had probably forgotten that a human was even present. "Excuse me," Jake said in a voice that was much calmer than he felt. "May I have permission to speak?" War Commander Thackalon snorted, a sound like distant thunder. "The human child wishes to address the council. What wisdom could your primitive species possibly offer to resolve matters of galactic importance?" Jake felt his face grow warm with embarrassment, but he kept his voice steady. "I would like to tell you a story," he said simply. The chamber erupted in surprised voices. Logic Prime Vexter's head tilted in what Jake had learned was the Zephyrian expression of confusion. "A story," the alien repeated. "You wish to waste the Council's time with fictional narratives when we face potential warfare." "It's not fiction," Jake replied. "It's about something that really happened in a small town on Earth called Riverside Falls, where I grew up. It's about three families who faced the same kind of problem you're dealing with now." Harmony Keeper Solana's colors shifted to softer hues. "Stories can carry wisdom," she said thoughtfully. "In our tradition, the oldest truths are preserved in tales passed down through generations. Perhaps we should listen." War Commander Thackalon made a gesture that Jake interpreted as permission to continue, though the Corvan leader clearly thought this was a waste of time. Logic Prime Vexter remained silent, but those glowing eyes were focused intently on Jake. Jake took a deep breath and began. In Riverside Falls, there were 3 families who had lived in the same neighborhood for generations. The Johnson family ran the military surplus store on Main Street. Old Pete Johnson was a veteran who believed that strength and preparation were the most important things in life. His family had always been the protectors of the town, the ones people called when there was trouble or danger. He could see that War Commander Thackalon was listening more carefully now. The description of the Johnson family seemed familiar to the Corvin way of thinking. The Chen family owned the technology repair shop. Jake continued. Linda Chen was brilliant with computers and electronics. She could fix anything and invent solutions to problems that seemed impossible. Her family believed that knowledge and innovation were the keys to making life better for everyone. Logic Prime Vexter's head tilted again, but this time with what looked like interest rather than confusion. The Martinez family tended the community garden and organized most of the town's social events. Maria Martinez knew everyone in Riverside Falls and seemed to understand how people felt even before they spoke. Her family followed traditions that went back hundreds of years and found meaning in their connection to the land and each other. Harmony Keeper Solana's colors brightened, and Jake could feel approval in the harmonies of her voice when she made small sounds of agreement. These 3 families had been arguing for decades over a piece of land at the edge of town. Jake went on. There was an old oak tree there that had been growing for over 200 years. Each family claimed the land belonged to them for different reasons. The alien delegates were listening more carefully now. Jake could see the parallels they were beginning to recognize. Pete Johnson said the land was his by right of strength because his grandfather had defended it during the town's early days. Linda Chen claimed it belonged to her family because they had the legal documents and surveys that proved ownership. Maria Martinez insisted it was sacred ground that belonged to her ancestors who had been buried nearby. War Commander Thackalon leaned forward slightly. Logic Prime Vexter's optical sensors focused more intently. Harmony Keeper Solana's empathic aura seemed to expand as she absorbed the emotional content of the story. The 3 families argued about that tree for so long that most people in town got tired of hearing about it, Jake said. They held meetings and hired lawyers and even had a few physical confrontations over the years. Each family was completely convinced that they were right and the others were wrong. Sound familiar? Jake paused and looked around the chamber. The silence that followed was different from the angry quiet that had filled the room earlier. This was the silence of beings who were beginning to understand that they might be about to learn something important. Jake looked around the chamber at the 3 groups of aliens who were waiting for him to continue. He could feel the tension in the air, but it was different now. Instead of anger aimed at each other, there was curiosity about where his story was leading. The arguing might have gone on forever, Jake said, but when I was 12 years old, something happened that changed everything. The worst storm in 50 years hit Riverside Falls. It rained for 3 days straight, harder than anyone had ever seen. The old dam that protected the lower part of town couldn't handle all that water. He paused, remembering that terrible night, when he had huddled with his family in their house on the hill, listening to the thunder and watching the lightning through the windows. On the 3rd night, the dam burst. Water came rushing down through the valley like a brown river full of debris and broken trees. The lower districts of town, where about half the families lived, were completely flooded. Houses were swept away. Cars disappeared under the water. People were trapped on rooftops, calling for help in the darkness. War Commander Thackalon's expression had changed. The Corvin leader was no longer showing signs of impatience. Jake had learned that the Corvin respected stories about survival and courage in the face of danger. My family lived on higher ground, so we were safe, Jake continued, but we could hear the sirens and see the emergency lights flashing through the rain. The whole town was in chaos. The regular emergency services were overwhelmed. They didn't have enough boats or equipment to rescue everyone who was trapped. Logic Prime Vextar spoke for the first time since Jake had begun his story. What was the calculated survival probability for the trapped individuals under those conditions? Not good, Jake admitted. The water was rising fast, and hypothermia was setting in. Some people had been clinging to rooftops for hours. Children were crying. Elderly folks couldn't hold on much longer. If something didn't change quickly, a lot of people were going to die. Harmony Keeper Solana's colors had shifted to deeper, more somber tones. The pain of such loss would echo through the community for generations, she said softly. That's when something amazing happened, Jake said, his voice growing stronger. Pete Johnson, the old military surplus guy who had been fighting with the other families for decades, suddenly forgot all about their argument. He loaded every boat, raft, and piece of emergency equipment from his store into his truck. Then he drove straight to the Chen family's house. The alien delegates were completely focused on Jake now. Even the background murmur of translation devices had stopped as everyone strained to hear what happened next. Pete pounded on Linda Chen's door and shouted over the storm noise. He told her that he needed her help to save people. Linda didn't hesitate for even a second. She grabbed her computer equipment and her emergency radio gear and jumped into Pete's truck. Together they drove to the Martinez house. Jake could picture that scene clearly in his memory. He had watched from his bedroom window as the truck with its headlights cutting through the rain had stopped at each house in turn. Maria Martinez was already organizing her neighbors, gathering blankets and medical supplies. When Pete and Linda arrived, the three of them looked at each other for just a moment. These were people who had been enemies for years, who had said terrible things about each other, who had refused to speak except through lawyers. "What did they do?" asked War Commander Thackalon, his voice gruff but genuinely interested. "They went to work," Jake said simply. Pete organized the rescue boats and the volunteers who would operate them. Linda used her radio equipment to coordinate communications and her computer to map the safest routes through the floodwater. Maria turned her family's property on the hill into an emergency shelter and medical station. Jake stood up and began walking slowly around the chamber as he spoke, making eye contact with delegates from all three species. Pete's military training taught him how to organize rescue operations under dangerous conditions. He knew which volunteers were strong enough to handle the boats and how to approach trapped people without putting everyone at risk. His boats went out into that dark water again and again, bringing back families who thought they were going to die. War Commander Thackalon nodded approvingly. The Corvan understood and respected military efficiency and the courage needed to face danger. For others, Linda's technology expertise let her create a communication network that connected all the rescue teams with the emergency coordinators. She calculated the flood patterns and predicted where the water would go next, so the boats could reach people before they were swept away. Her equipment saved dozens of lives by getting rescuers to the right places at the right time. Logic Prime Vexter made a sound that Jake had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of agreement. The value of technological solutions was obvious to their scientific minds. Maria's knowledge of the community and her ability to organize people turned the rescue operation into something that actually worked. She knew which families had elderly members who couldn't swim, which houses had children who would be too scared to leave with strangers, and which neighbors had medical training that could help with injuries. Her shelter became the heart of the whole effort. Harmony Keeper Solana's colors brightened, reflecting appreciation for the community, connections, and emotional intelligence that had guided the rescue. The three families worked all night long, Jake continued. They didn't stop to argue about who was in charge or whose methods were better. They didn't waste time deciding who deserved credit or who should make the decisions. They just focused on saving lives. The chamber had become completely quiet except for Jake's voice. Even the soft humming of the station's systems seemed muted. By dawn, they had rescued everyone from the flooded areas. 347 people were brought to safety. Not a single person died, even though experts later said the flood should have killed dozens of them. The three families had achieved something that none of them could have done alone. Jake stopped walking and faced the three groups of delegates directly. "But here's the really important part," he said. After the emergency was over, after all, the flood victims had been taken care of and the cleanup had begun. The three families could have gone back to fighting about that oak tree. They could have returned to their old arguments and their old hatred. Everyone would have understood if they had. "Did they?" asked Harmony Keeper Solana, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "No," Jake said with a smile. They realized that they had discovered something much more valuable than winning an argument. They had found out what they could accomplish when they worked together instead of against each other. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of possibilities that none of the delegates had considered before. Jake could see in their faces and postures that they were beginning to understand the real meaning of his story. The oak tree was still there, Jake said quietly, but it wasn't a prize to be fought over anymore. It became a symbol of what they had built together, a reminder that their greatest strength came not from defeating each other, but from combining their different abilities for a common purpose. The silence in the council chamber stretched on as the three groups of delegates absorbed what Jake had told them. He could see the wheels turning in their minds as they considered the parallels between his simple Earth story and their own complex Galactic situation. Logic Prime Vexter was the first to speak. The mathematical probability matrices for successful outcomes increase significantly when complementary skill sets are combined rather than competing. The Zephyrian admitted in that emotionless voice, "Our analytical models have always shown this result, but psychological factors prevented serious consideration of cooperative frameworks." War Commander Thackalon shifted in his massive chair, the metal creaking under his weight. In military strategy, the most decisive victories often result from unexpected alliances, he said grudgingly. An enemy's strength can become your own strength if you find the right approach, but trust is difficult when survival is at stake. Harmony. Solana's colors had shifted to warm golds and soft blues. The ancient teachings speak of the river that is formed when many streams converge, she said thoughtfully. Each stream retains its own nature while contributing to something greater than any could achieve alone. Perhaps we have been so focused on preserving our individual paths that we have forgotten the destination we all seek. Jake felt a surge of hope as he listened to their words. For the first time since he had arrived at New Geneva, the three species were actually considering each other's perspectives instead of just defending their own positions. "There's more to the story," Jake said carefully. "Something I haven't told you yet that I think you need to hear." War Commander Thackalon leaned forward. "Speak, human. What other wisdom does your tale contain?" Jake took a deep breath. This was the part he had been building toward, the revelation that he hoped would make them understand the true urgency of their situation. 6 months after the flood, Pete Johnson was working in his store when Linda Chen came running in with her laptop computer. She had been analyzing satellite data as part of her volunteer work with the County Emergency Management Office. What she found scared her more than the flood had. The delegates waited expectantly. Jake could feel the attention of every being in the chamber focused on his words. There was a massive storm system building up in the mountains, bigger than anything in recorded history. The computer models showed that it would hit Riverside Falls in less than 48 hours. But this time, it wouldn't just be rain. The storm would bring tornadoes, hail the size of golf balls, and winds strong enough to level buildings. Jake began walking again, his voice growing more intense as he described the crisis. Linda's calculations showed that the storm would destroy not just the lower districts but the entire town. The emergency shelters weren't strong enough to protect everyone. The evacuation routes would be blocked by debris. Hundreds of people would die unless something was done immediately. "What did they do?" asked Harmony Keeper Solana, her colors shifting to anxious purples and grays. "They did what they had learned to do during the flood," Jake replied. "They worked together, but this time, they had to think bigger and move faster than ever before." Jake described how Pete Johnson had used his military contacts to get access to heavy construction equipment and temporary shelter materials. Linda Chen had coordinated with weather services and engineering experts to design a network of reinforced community shelters. Maria Martinez had organized the entire town into evacuation and preparation teams. They had less than 2 days to save everyone, Jake continued. Pete's logistics experience let him move equipment and supplies where they were needed most. Linda's technology skills enabled real-time coordination of dozens of work crews across the county. Maria's understanding of the community ensured that no one was forgotten or left behind. Logic Prime Vexstar made a soft clicking sound that indicated deep thought. The complexity of coordinating such an operation would require exceptional organizational capabilities. The Zephyrian observed. It would have been impossible for any one of them to handle alone, Jake agreed. But together, they pulled off a miracle. When that superstorm hit Riverside Falls, every single person in town was safe in one of the reinforced shelters they had built. The storm destroyed half the buildings and knocked down trees that had stood for centuries, but nobody died, not one person. War Commander Thackalon's gray skin had lightened to a shade that Jake recognized as indicating respect and approval. "A worthy victory," the Corvan leader said simply. "But here's what they learned from that experience," Jake said, his voice becoming more serious. The storm that threatened Riverside Falls was just part of a much larger weather pattern that was affecting the entire region. Climate change was making these extreme events more common and more dangerous. If they wanted to protect their community in the long term, they needed to think beyond just their own town. Harmony Keeper Solana's harmonious voice carried a note of understanding. They realized that their individual survival depended on the health of the larger system. "Exactly," Jake said. So they reached out to other communities, sharing their experience and their techniques for disaster preparation. Pete's military network connected them with emergency coordinators across 3 states. Linda's technology solutions were adapted for use by dozens of other towns. Maria's community organization methods became a model for rural disaster planning. Jake stopped walking and faced the three groups of delegates directly. Within 5 years, the cooperation that had started with 3 feuding families had grown into a regional alliance that saved thousands of lives and protected millions of dollars worth of property. They didn't lose their individual identities or give up their unique strengths, but they learned that those strengths were most powerful when they were shared rather than hoarded. The chamber was completely silent as the implications of Jake's words sank in. He could see that each group of delegates was beginning to understand how the story connected to their own situation. Now, Jake said quietly, "Let me tell you about the storm that's heading for all of us." He activated his personal datapad and projected a holographic display that showed the Kepler 442 system. The image rotated slowly, showing the disputed worlds that contained the quantum crystal deposits. "While you've been arguing about who has the right to claim these worlds," Jake said, "our deep space monitoring stations have detected something that threatens to make your argument meaningless." The holographic display zoomed out to show the stellar neighborhood around Kepler 442. Jake highlighted a region of space where the stars seemed dimmer and more distorted than they should be. "There's a cascading gravitational collapse occurring in this region," Jake explained. "It started with a binary star system that went unstable 3 months ago. The gravitational waves from that collapse are affecting nearby stars, creating a chain reaction that's spreading through local space." Logic Prime Vecstars optical sensors focused intently on the display. "Show me the mathematical progression," the Zephyrian demanded. Jake expanded the hologram to include trajectory calculations and probability matrices. "At current rates of expansion, the collapse will reach the Kepler 442 system in 18 months. When it does, the gravitational distortion will tear apart not just the disputed worlds, but everything within 50 light-years. Thackalon stood up abruptly, his massive frame towering over the holographic display. "How many inhabited systems are in the affected region?" 17, Jake said simply, "including 3 major Corvan military bases, 2 Zephyrian research colonies, and 4 Vallani meditation retreats, plus 8 systems with mixed populations from various species. We're looking at the potential deaths of over 2 billion sentient beings." The number hung in the air like a weight that pressed down on everyone in the chamber. Harmony Keeper Solana's colors had shifted to deep blacks and grays that reflected the magnitude of the tragedy they were facing. "Can the collapse be stopped?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already feared the answer. Jake nodded slowly. "Our scientists believe it's possible, but only if we act quickly and use every resource available. The solution would require unprecedented cooperation between species with different technologies and capabilities." He looked directly at each group of delegates as he continued. "The Corvan have the industrial capacity and logistical expertise to build and deploy the massive stellar stabilizers that would be needed. The Zephyrians have the advanced scientific knowledge to calculate precisely where and how those stabilizers must be positioned. The Vallani have energy manipulation abilities that could provide the power needed to make the stabilizers effective." Jake paused to let that information sink in before delivering his final point. "Separately, none of your species can stop this disaster. Together you might be able to save billions of lives and preserve dozens of worlds, but only if you can overcome the same kind of thinking that kept 3 families fighting over a tree while their entire community was threatened by forces beyond any of their individual control." The holographic display continued to rotate slowly in the center of the chamber, showing the inexorable spread of gravitational collapse through space. Each delegate stared at the projection with growing understanding of what they were facing. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Finally, War Commander Thackalon spoke, his voice lower and more thoughtful than Jake had ever heard it. "Show me the technical requirements for these stellar stabilizers." Jake manipulated the display to show detailed schematics and engineering specifications. "Each stabilizer would be roughly the size of a small moon," he explained. "They would need to be constructed from quantum-reinforced materials and positioned at precise gravitational nodes around the collapse zone. The construction timeline is critical. We have perhaps 14 months to build and deploy them before the window of opportunity closes." Logic Prime Vexter S head tilted as the Zephyrian absorbed the technical data. "The computational complexity for calculating optimal placement positions exceeds our current processing capabilities by a factor of 12, the alien admitted. "However, if we were to network our primary research computers with supplementary processing units, the calculations could be completed within acceptable parameters, but you would need massive industrial infrastructure to actually build these devices, Jake pointed out. The quantum-reinforced materials alone would require the output of hundreds of manufacturing facilities working in perfect coordination. War Commander Thackalon's gray skin had taken on a greenish tint that Jake had learned indicated deep concentration in Corvan physiology. The Empire possesses 17 major industrial worlds and 43 orbital manufacturing platforms, the commander said slowly. Our logistics networks could coordinate the construction and deployment of such devices, but only if we had precise specifications and power sources capable of maintaining quantum coherence over interstellar distances. Harmony Keeper Solana had been quiet during the technical discussion, but now her colors shifted to the bright golds and deep blues that indicated she was accessing her species' collective knowledge. The energy manipulation techniques preserved in our oldest teachings speak of focusing stellar winds and cosmic currents, she said in her harmonious voice. Such methods could potentially provide the power needed to maintain quantum coherence, but only if the stabilizers were designed to work with natural energy flows rather than against them. Jake felt excitement building in his chest as he watched the three species begin to consider practical cooperation instead of theoretical competition, but he also knew that technical capability was only part of the challenge they faced. The engineering problems can be solved, Jake said carefully, but there are other issues we need to address. Each of your species has legitimate concerns about sharing your most advanced technologies and capabilities with potential rivals. Logic Prime Vextor's optical sensors focused on Jake with uncomfortable intensity. Zephyrian quantum computation methods represent thousands of years of scientific advancement. The knowledge required to network our research computers could be used to infiltrate or compromise our data systems. War Commander Thackalon crossed his massive arms. Corvan industrial techniques are military secrets that have protected our empire for centuries. Sharing construction capabilities could provide intelligence that enemies might use against us in future conflicts. Harmony Keeper Solana's harmonies carried notes of sadness and concern. The energy manipulation teachings are sacred knowledge passed down through generations of spiritual training. To use them for technological purposes might corrupt their essential nature and disturb the cosmic balance they were meant to preserve. Jake nodded, understanding that each species had valid reasons for their caution. Trust was not something that could be demanded or imposed. It had to be built carefully through shared experience and demonstrated good faith. Let me tell you what happened when Pete Johnson, Linda Chen, and Maria Martinez faced similar concerns, Jake said. He described how the three families had initially been reluctant to share their most valuable resources and knowledge. Pete worried that revealing his emergency supply locations might leave his family vulnerable if future disasters struck. Linda feared that sharing her technical expertise might help competitors who could use her innovations against her. Maria was concerned that opening her family's traditional practices to outsiders might dilute their cultural significance. They solved the problem by creating a structure that protected everyone's essential interests while enabling genuine cooperation, Jake explained. Instead of demanding that each family give up their unique advantages, they designed a system where each could contribute their strengths while maintaining control over their core assets. Jake activated his datapad again and projected a new holographic display showing an organizational structure that could apply to their current situation. Pete maintained operational security by retaining command authority over his military assets. While accepting strategic guidance from the Joint Planning Committee, Linda protected her technical innovations through shared benefit licensing agreements that prevented misuse while enabling collaborative development. Maria preserved the spiritual integrity of her family's practices by serving as the exclusive interpreter of traditional knowledge while allowing others to benefit from her insights. The three groups of delegates studied the organizational chart with obvious interest. Jake could see them beginning to understand how such a structure might address their own concerns. The key insight, Jake continued, was that cooperation didn't require anyone to surrender their identity or compromise their essential values. It just meant finding ways to combine their different strengths toward a common goal. War Commander Thackalon leaned forward to examine the command structure more closely. Joint operations with divided authority can be problematic, he observed. Military efficiency requires clear chains of command and unified decision-making. True, Jake agreed. But this wouldn't be a traditional military operation. It would be more like a massive engineering project that happens to require military-level logistics and coordination. The Corvin would maintain command authority over industrial operations and deployment strategies, but within an overall framework designed by Zephyrian scientific analysis and powered by Vallani energy techniques. Logic Prime Vexstar made the clicking sound that indicated analytical processing. A modular approach to cooperation could address security concerns while enabling necessary information sharing. The Zephyrian mused. Compartmentalized knowledge transfer protocols could protect sensitive technologies while providing sufficient data for system integration. Harmony Keeper Solana's colors shifted to contemplative purples and golds. If the energy manipulation techniques were applied through Vallani practitioners rather than technological replication, the sacred nature of the knowledge could be preserved while still providing the necessary power sources. Jake felt a surge of hope as he watched the three species work through the practical details of cooperation, but he knew there was still one more hurdle they needed to overcome. "There's something else you need to consider," Jake said quietly. "Even if we can solve the technical and security issues, this project will require a level of trust and commitment that goes beyond your immediate crisis. The stellar stabilizers will need to be maintained and monitored for decades after the initial deployment. You'll be creating a long-term relationship that will outlast any of your current leaders." The chamber fell silent again as the delegates absorbed the implications of that statement. They weren't just talking about a temporary alliance to address a single threat. They were considering the foundation for ongoing cooperation that could reshape galactic politics. War Commander Thackalon was the first to speak. "The Corvin Empire has always honored its commitments to worthy allies," he said formally. "If this alliance proves its value in protecting our people and our interests, there would be grounds for extending the relationship beyond the immediate crisis." Logic Prime Vexstar's response was more cautious. Long-term cooperation would require comprehensive agreements addressing intellectual property rights, technology transfer protocols, and dispute resolution mechanisms. However, the potential benefits of sustained collaboration could justify the necessary diplomatic complexity. Harmony Kapar Solana's harmonies carried notes of hope mixed with uncertainty. The spiritual teachings suggest that relationships forged in the face of great challenges often become the strongest bonds between peoples. If we can work together to preserve life and protect the cosmic balance, perhaps we can learn to see each other as partners rather than rivals. Jake looked around the chamber at the faces and forms of beings who had been enemies just hours earlier. Now they were seriously discussing not just temporary cooperation but the possibility of lasting alliance. It was more than he had dared to hope for when he had first stood up to tell his simple story about three feuding families. "The choice is yours," Jake said simply. "You can continue fighting over the quantum crystals in the Kepler 442 system until the gravitational collapse destroys them along with everything else in the region." The chamber remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Jake watched as each group of delegates engaged in quiet conversations using their own languages and communication methods. The Corvin spoke in low, rumbling tones that sounded like distant thunder. The Zephyrians exchanged rapid bursts of light patterns through their optical sensors. The Vallani communicated through subtle changes in their harmonious emanations that created complex emotional resonances. Finally, Harmony Keeper Solana stood gracefully, her colors shifting to the warm golds and bright blues that indicated positive decision-making. "The Vallani Confederation will participate in this alliance," she announced. "Our spiritual teachings have always emphasized that individual strength finds its greatest expression when combined with others in service of life and harmony. We will share our energy manipulation techniques under the protocols suggested by the human delegate." Logic Prime Vexstar was next to speak, rising with the precise mechanical movements characteristic of Zephyrian physiology. "Analysis indicates that cooperative outcomes provide optimal probability matrices for species survival and advancement," the alien stated. "The Zephyrian Collective will contribute our computational resources and scientific expertise to this joint venture, subject to appropriate security protocols and intellectual property protections." All eyes turned to War Commander Thackalon. The massive Corvin leader sat motionless for several long moments, his gray skin cycling through various shades as he processed the decision. Finally, he stood to his full imposing height and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of countless military campaigns. "The Corvin Empire has never retreated from a worthy challenge," he declared. "This threat to billions of our people demands the kind of decisive action that has always defined our greatness. We will provide the industrial capacity and logistical coordination necessary to build and deploy these stellar stabilizers. The Empire stands ready to honor this alliance. Jake felt a wave of relief and excitement wash over him as the three species formally committed to working together. But he knew that making the decision was only the first step in a long and difficult process. Excellent, Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the magnitude of what had just been accomplished. Now we need to establish the practical framework for this cooperation. I suggest we start by creating joint planning committees that can begin detailed work on engineering specifications and deployment strategies. Over the following hours, the three species worked together to design an alliance structure that addressed everyone's concerns while enabling effective collaboration. The Corvan would establish joint industrial facilities where their manufacturing expertise could be combined with Zephyrian technological innovations and Vellani energy enhancement techniques. The Zephyrians would create secure communication networks that allowed real-time coordination while protecting sensitive information. The Vellani would train selected practitioners from all three species in energy manipulation methods, ensuring that the knowledge could be applied even if something happened to the original teachers. Most importantly, they agreed that humanity would serve as neutral mediators and coordinators for the project. Earth's relative neutrality and recent experience with interspecies diplomacy made humans ideal candidates for managing the complex relationships between three very different civilizations. The work began immediately. Within weeks, Corvan industrial ships were arriving at designated construction sites, carrying materials and equipment on a scale that dwarfed any previous galactic engineering project. Zephyrian research vessels deployed sophisticated monitoring equipment throughout the collapse zone, gathering the data needed for precise calculations of stabilizer placement. Vellani meditation ships took positions at strategic energy nodes, their practitioners beginning the delicate work of preparing cosmic currents for the massive power requirements. Jake found himself at the center of it all, serving as the primary human liaison between the three species. His days were filled with meetings, technical briefings, and diplomatic negotiations as various problems and disagreements arose. The alliance was strong, but it was also new, and trust had to be built one successful collaboration at a time. 3 months into the project, they achieved their first major milestone when a prototype stellar stabilizer was successfully tested in an uninhabited system. The device worked exactly as designed, creating a localized gravitational field that could counteract the effects of the expanding collapse. More importantly, the test demonstrated that Corvan engineering, Zephyrian science, and Vellani energy techniques could indeed be combined into something greater than any of them could achieve alone. 6 months later, the first production stabilizers were deployed at the edge of the collapse zone. Jake stood on the observation deck of the Joint Command ship, watching as massive Corvan construction vessels maneuvered the moon-sized devices into position under the guidance of Zephyrian navigation computers. Around each stabilizer, practitioners worked in harmony to channel the cosmic energies that would power the quantum containment fields. The deployment was flawless. As each stabilizer came online, the gravitational distortions in the surrounding space began to stabilize, and then reverse. The cascade effect that had threatened to destroy dozens of star systems was gradually brought under control, contained within a manageable region of space that could be safely monitored and maintained. When the final stabilizer was activated, Jake felt tears running down his cheeks as he watched the readouts showing that the crisis had been averted. Billions of lives had been saved. Dozens of worlds would continue to exist. The three species had not only proven they could work together, they had accomplished something that would be remembered for thousands of years. But the real transformation became apparent in the months that followed. The alliance structures, created for the Stellar Stabilizer project, evolved into permanent cooperative institutions. Joint research facilities were established, where scientists from all three species worked together on projects that benefited everyone. Cultural exchange programs brought together military officers, engineers, and spiritual teachers who discovered they had more in common than they had ever imagined. The territorial disputes that had once seemed so important faded into insignificance. As the three species realized how much they could accomplish through cooperation, the quantum crystals in the Kepler 442 system became the foundation for a joint mining operation that provided resources for continued collaborative projects throughout the galaxy. 1 year after the completion of the Stellar Stabilizer project, Jake stood once again in the observation deck of New Geneva Station. But now he was not alone. The deck was filled with beings from all three species, working together on plans for new initiatives and celebrating their shared achievements. War Commander Thackalon approached, moving with the confident stride of a leader who had found worthy allies. Human Jake, the Corvan said in his rumbling voice, I have received word from our homeworld. The Empire wishes to establish a permanent cultural exchange with Earth. Your people's gift for bringing others together has earned our respect and friendship. Logic Prime Vexter joined them, optical sensors glowing with what Jake had learned was the Zephyrian expression of satisfaction. Collaborative outcomes continue to exceed projected parameters, the alien stated. The collective is prepared to share advanced technologies with human researchers in recognition of your species' diplomatic contributions to galactic stability. Harmony Keeper Solana approached with her characteristic flowing movement, colors shifting through a spectrum of warm, positive hues. The spiritual energies throughout this region of space have achieved a harmony that has not existed for millennia, she said in her melodious voice. The Valani offer to establish meditation centers on Earth, where your people can learn the ancient techniques for finding peace within themselves and with others. Jake smiled as he listened to their offers. A year ago, these three species had been on the verge of war over disputed territory. Now, they were competing to build stronger relationships with humanity and with each other. There's something I should tell you, Jake said, pulling out a small datapad. I received a message from Earth this morning. Riverside Falls has been selected as the site for the new Interspecies Cooperation Institute. The town council has decided to establish sister city relationships with a Corvan military academy, a Zephyrian research center, and a Valani spiritual retreat. He paused, smiling at the expressions of interest and approval on the faces around him. They're planning to build the institute's main building right next to that old oak tree I told you about, Jake continued. Pete Johnson's grandson is studying engineering and wants to work on interstellar construction projects. Linda Chen's daughter is learning Valani energy techniques to combine with her family's technological expertise. Maria Martinez's son is joining the diplomatic corps to help other species learn to work together the way his grandmother's generation learned to cooperate. Jake looked out at the stars, visible through the observation deck's transparent walls. The funny thing is, none of them think what they're doing is particularly remarkable.